A number of times. Thank you for letting me come back. Most of the time I talk exceedingly fast over something that maybe I don't know as much about as I think I do. My wife reminded me one time, I think it was in your class, but I covered the entire Bible in less than an hour. I'm not gonna do that today. I am gonna though talk about sort of why I do the work I do, but I want to put it in the context of why I believe that the church is in an existential crisis. So I think this was true before the pandemic, but the pandemic has truly brought it out. So to ask the question, so why do we do church? We've just spent an incredible amount of time and angst in almost every congregation I know, no matter what the denomination, wondering about how are we going to pay the bills? How are we going to take care of these buildings? How do we find clergy that can lead us in the right path? And we haven't come up with good answers to that. To me, the real challenge is having us ask the question, why would people go to church in today's world? What's the point? And where I feel like we have completely missed the boat, and where we actually have an opportunity to get back on the boat, is to recognize that it can't just be about me. It can't just be about my life and me and thee with God, because I don't necessarily need the church if it's just about me and God. I can go do that out in the wilderness, right? Or I can now do it via Zoom. And why do I have to come to Idlewild? Because the best preachers in the world are at my beckon by just a few clicks, if all I want is some sort of inspirational message. So church has to be about something more than just feeling good, right? Because that's what I'm fairly confident every last one of you is looking for. And you have had the thought, whether you spoke it aloud or not, to say, am I really getting it here? So I think you can get it here, but it takes a way for all of us to use this opportunity to rethink what we're about. And so the pandemic has given us that opportunity. I also think what's happening in Ukraine is another example of where is the church in all of that? What are we doing other than sitting back and watching and telling everybody what a horrible person Putin is? What is this about who we are and how it impacts our faith? So this is not a full answer for everybody, but I'm going to tell you one way that I think we ought to just rethink what we're trying to do. And it's, what's driven me for my entire career. So going back to the Bible, I think connecting to our bodies and our spirits and to fully embrace the concept of what healing is a path forward for us. And it's a path that the church has historically been on. And in today's world, we have just sort of completely forgotten that this is something that people of faith should care about. So to start with, just looking at how the Bible views our bodies, in Genesis, when in the chapter 1, as God creates, the light and whatever, at the end of that passage, it always says, and it was good. And then on the 6th day, God creates humanity, creates our bodies, and defines it to be not just good, but to be very good. Now, just to start there, somewhere along the way, this idea of who we are as human beings that are fully connected, in Genesis 2, when we read about Adam and Eve, God creates Adam out of the dust of the earth. And it is only when we are dust and breath that we are fully human. So what we are not are spiritual beings that are caught in a web of dross. That idea that the body is the prison house of the soul, and that what we long for is for our spirits to be released from the body and go to the eternal. It may turn out to be that is exactly how it is. But if it turns out to be right, it means that Plato was right and everything the Bible says was totally wrong. Because this is totally a Platonic idea that says we are a spark of the divine that is broken off and is encapsulated into this veil of flesh. And then what we long for is to be done with the body so that our spirits can return to the eternal. So that idea is a fundamentally non-Christian idea. I'm going to come back and talk about why I think that in just a minute, or why I don't think that. It's why I'm certain that's what we think. Because the Bible's perspective is always that we are dust and breath. We cannot be fully human without finding a way to actually care for this body of ours. So when we get to the New Testament, there are three things that you are required to do if you want to follow Jesus. What are they?
Do justice.
Okay, that's actually Micah, but I'm good with you on that.
Love God, love our neighbor. That's it.
You are to preach, you are to teach, and you are to heal. That message is over and over again, the message of the New Testament. To preach, to teach, and to heal. So just to look at Luke, Acts, same guy writes Luke and Acts. The story we focus on is the story of Jesus. I actually think the author is not trying to tell us the story of Jesus. In the first century, everybody already knows the story of Jesus. We don't need to know who Jesus is and what he did. What we need to know is, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Now, make it clear, it is not about what it means to believe in Jesus. Because Jesus at no point says, believe in me. What Jesus always says is, follow me. So how do you follow Jesus? So Luke and Acts tell this story and divides it into these three concepts: to preach, to teach, and to heal. That is what Jesus does in Luke. He preaches, he teaches, and sadly, I think the appeal to Jesus in his contemporary world is not what he said, but that he was a faith healer and that people could bring their children to him and he had this miraculous ability to heal them. It was all about me. It wasn't ultimately about God. It was about what Jesus could do for me and mine. That was the appeal. And so in telling this story, Luke actually defines 17 different acts of healing that Jesus does in Luke. And then we get to Acts, because Acts is about what I think the real point that Luke's trying to make is, what does it mean to follow Jesus? So he tells his story primarily by following two characters.
Peter
and Paul, very good. So Peter and Paul, totally different from each other. See the world completely different in 1,000 different ways. And yet, as he tells the story of Peter and Paul, that's exactly what we follow both of them doing. They preach, they teach, and they heal. And in Acts, there are actually 19 recorded acts of healing that the disciples do. Only 17 in Luke, 19 in Acts. Now, included in this, in trying to see how Peter and Paul does this, the author wants to make sure he gets it completely right. So there's one other thing that Jesus does in Luke, which is he raises people from the dead. So in both stories of Peter and Paul, there are stories of them raising people from the dead. So my absolute favorite story in the entire Bible is that Paul, who's clearly a very long-winded preacher, is giving a sermon. The room is packed. There's a young guy sitting in a window who falls asleep, falls out of the window and is dead. and it's incumbent on Paul to go and raise him from the dead. So if David starts having a little long-winded sermon at some point, you might remind him that if he is going to do that, he better be prepared to raise people from the dead. All right, so to preach, to teach, and to heal. This is the path of how you follow Jesus. Now, who is it that this healing ministry should be about? Well, in the rest of the New Testament, we have a number of examples of how the church is supposed to be engaged in this. So it's not just about faith healing. Two examples here is that in Timothy, Paul tells Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach that ails him. So he is not telling Timothy, get a little buzz on and you'll feel better. He is actually using a Greek medical technique, which is probably not particularly good medicine, but it was the medicine of the time to try to deal with his stomach issues. And then in James, it says, is any among you sick? Then let them call for the elders of the church, and they will anoint them with oil. Now, we think of that as a ceremonial anointing with oil, but again, it is seen as a Greek medical technique that the church is expected to do. In fact, the leaders of the church, in order to bring people back to wholeness in both body and spirit. And then if you look at who is it that this healing takes place with? Well, it's really the entire community, but there is a real focus on the poor. At every turn, there is a focus on the poor. So how does the church ultimately take this seriously? What does it look like? So in the early church, we go from, at the end of the New Testament, there may be, from Jesus, you have Jesus, he's raised from the dead, and then you have the disciples as a small group. They experience the risen Christ. And when we finish the story, I don't know, maybe there are 30 people following Jesus, maybe more. They don't count the women, so probably a lot more. So how do you go from this handful of people following Jesus to, by the time of Constantine, Constantine converts to Christianity, not necessarily because he believes in Jesus, but because from a political standpoint, he sees the writing on the wall that this is where Rome is headed. And so Constantine converts and makes Christianity the religion of Rome. So how does that happen? Now, most preachers are going to tell you it happens because of good preaching. I'm here to tell you that had almost nothing to do with it. What happens is that during the second and third century, there are plagues all over the Roman world. And when people get sick, it is only the Christians who are willing to take care of them. And the Christians care for people at a time when it is assumed that not only will people die, but you might die as well. May we call it a pandemic. And when people get better, they ask the question, who is your God that I might worship him? This is what grows the church, and this is what we got to think long and hard about. Is there a way in today's world for us to take seriously what the role of the church is, that's not just about trying to tell people to believe what we believe, but to find a way to help all of us follow Jesus. Now, this idea around healthcare actually becomes central to how the church thinks of itself as time goes on. And yet, somewhere along the way, we have just missed the memo. So hospitals become developed as a result of the church's commitment, especially during times of war, during the Crusades, despite everything that's horrible that happens during the Crusades, when people get injured and hurt a long way from home, it is the church that finds a way to care for people along the path, and it becomes a very important time of revival within the church. Now, when we get to America, prior to the Civil War, if you were sick, the most likely person anybody would have seen for healthcare was actually a pastor. Pastors provided virtually all the healthcare there was in this country. That's how it works. You know, partly because they were the most learned person in the community, but also because of everything I've been telling you up until now. Two examples of this that hopefully you're familiar with. One, Cotton Mather, who most people think of as a hellfire and brimstone preacher. Mather actually initiated the notion of inoculation. He inoculated the entire city of Boston against smallpox. Is considered to be the first significant figure in American medicine. The fact that you are now vaccinated against COVID, there is a direct line to Cotton Mather. Now, things don't always go the way you would expect them to. One of the persons who ultimately gets inoculated with against smallpox, the way Mather did it, is Jonathan Edwards. Some Presbyterians would consider him to be the greatest theologian America's ever produced. Little small problem with the inoculation is that it killed Jonathan Edwards. But I'm telling you, in medicine, you lose one theologian, it is not a great loss. And you can still claim it as a great success. Now, the other person who's near and dear to my heart, and I hope to yours at some level, is John Wesley. So John Wesley, founder of the Methodist Church, actually thought of himself as a physician. He practiced medicine from the day he was 19 until he died. He wrote several books on healthcare. His book, Primitive Physics, which is a self-help healthcare manual, was so successful in the American frontier that as late as 1850, if we were in Memphis in 1850, there would have been a greater chance that you would have had a copy of Wesley's book, Primitive Physics, than you would your own copy of the Bible. Now, I fully confess Wesley had some unusual ideas. He had at least 18 different cures for baldness. Mike, this is where you need to start taking notes. I've tried most of them myself. So my favorite is you take a big red onion, you cut it in half, you rub it on your head until it turns red, and then you put honey on it. Now, if that doesn't work, you could use Wesley's tried and true method for anything, which is you can electrify it. Wesley actually saw a demonstration of static electricity that was put on by Benjamin Franklin in London, and he was so enamored with the idea that he went home and in his garage he created a little thing he called an electrifier. And if you read his diaries, he used it virtually every day. However, it's not quite as crazy as it sounds. Somebody falls down dead right now, you probably want us to put a little electricity through your heart. Electricity is actually incredibly important in how our bodies work, to the point where, you know, we have built an entire medical industrial complex in America built around chemistry, right? Taking pills to solve whatever problem you have. Why exactly do we think that a chemical whatever could impact my heart, which runs off electricity, my brain, which runs off electricity, my muscles? Our bodies are far more electrical units than they are chemical. It's like sending the plumber to fix your flickering light at home. That's generally not the right person, right? So our advanced science sometimes might not be exactly right. For example, John Wesley is a contemporary with George Washington. You may not think of that is, but so Wesley in the 18th century is the primary advocate against the use of polypharmacy. Wesley believed that there should be one drug for one problem, except for in the 18th century, it was generally thought the more drugs, the better. That sounds a whole lot like the 21st century. Wesley was against using leaching, bleeding, the use of quicksilver. Instead, he advocated things like clean air, fresh water, more exercise. Now, I do confess he thought that riding a horse would cure almost anything. Wesley rode a horse every day of his life for 2 hours for almost 70 years. Even in his house, if it was pouring down rain, he had this little thing that he would bounce up and down on, simulating riding a horse, and he'd do it for 2 hours. So anybody know how George Washington dies? It's December 4th. He's walking around Mount Vernon trying to figure out which trees he's going to take down over the winter. He ends up getting sick. We now know he had something that's probably called epiglottitis. And as a result, they called the best doctors in America to take care of him. And their solution was they bled him of 5 units of blood and he died. Right. So sometimes cutting edge medicine might need to be thought through a little bit. Had they called Wesley, he would have never let that happen. He would have gotten him up on his horse and ridden him around Mount Vernon. It might not have helped, but it wouldn't have cured him. All right, more to the point. Wesley believed that every Methodist society and indeed every church should be involved in direct, hands-on healthcare. For Wesley, it mostly had to do with the coal miners of Western England. But when he came to America, even though he was not a very successful evangelist, for 2 years being in America, Wesley did not convert a single person. However, his ideas around healthcare caught on, spread all over the country until as late as 1863, a pastor in Guilford, Connecticut, wrote the standard textbook of physiology for the entire country. So what happened? Because that's clearly not the way it is today, right? You know, how did we get to where the thought of the church being involved in healthcare and healthcare for the poor being at the heart of who we are as Christians? That is like a nutty idea for most people. Well, 3 things I think happened that got us to where we are. And these are all 3 things we have to overcome at some level. Number 1, the split between science and religion that comes about because of Darwin. You should never underestimate the influence of Darwin. It's been profound. We experience it literally every day. The second is that during the late 19th, early 20th century, there is an explosion in medical science. A lot of new medical treatments that are better than Wesley's folk remedies. Sadly, still no cure for baldness. But with that, there arises a new profession known as medicine. It is seen as financially lucrative. It makes sense to keep the clergy out, and the truth is the clergy are too lazy to keep up with all the new knowledge. Now, the third thing, the most important thing, something that I've already alluded to, is that during the same time frame, late 19th, early 20th century, there is a reassertion of a philosophical idea known as Cartesian dualism. Descartes' idea, it's a recapitulation of Plato, that says we can take a human being and separate us into a body and a spirit. We put the body on one side and say it's the purview of science and medicine. We put the spirit on the other and say that it's okay for the church to mess around with your spirit, but heaven forbid it cross this line and actually care about our bodies. Well, as I've already talked about, that idea is a fundamentally non-Christian, non-Jewish, non-Muslim, non-Hindu idea. And we all intuitively know there's something wrong with it. You know, what affects my body affects my spirit and vice versa. You know, I guarantee you right now, there is somebody in one of the emergency rooms here in Memphis who has shown up in the ER complaining that their heart hurts. And we're now gonna do all sorts of tests. We will ultimately do a cardiac catheterization. We might MRI their chest, and the tests are all going to be normal. And we're going to tell the person there's nothing wrong with your heart and send them home. And the problem is that you can MRI somebody's chest all day long, and you will never know what a broken heart looks like. You know, our medical way of caring for people cannot identify what are fundamentally spiritual issues. Because the spirit just can't be part of how we care for the body, or so we think. Now, the other side of this is that in our churches, we have blessed the sin of gluttony for the sake of fellowship. You know, the least healthy meal you could eat every week is at our church. In the midst of the obesity epidemic in America, clergy are actually 20% heavier than the rest of the population. Now, you cannot have a healthy church if you don't have healthy leaders. And we in the church have to find a way to realize that this body and caring for it is at the heart of the gospel. You know, everything I've been talking to about are things that the church has always cared deeply about, but somewhere in the last 150 years, we have just gotten totally off base. But here is an opportunity now, I think, for us to get back on track. Now, how does this work, and how do we do it moving forward? So, as you know, church health focuses on caring for the working uninsured, people who work to make our lives comfortable. They cook our food, they take care of our children, they wash our dishes, they cut our grass, they'll one day dig our graves. They don't complain. Yet when they get sick, their options are very few. How did we come in America to where there are so many people who are in this category who are working for us, and yet when they get sick, they have very few options? So the other part of that is, how did we get to where we have hospitals that have church names on them all over this country, and yet they have nothing to do with worshiping congregations? How did those two things come together at the same time? And is our rethinking church, by connecting this back together, a way out of us for us to find church to be fully encompassing of what we were called to do? So, how the hospitals got to have church names on them. In the late 19th century, along with this reassertion of Cartesian dualism, at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a theological movement called the social gospel movement, led by a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch. And Rauschenbusch and a lot of Presbyterians believed that all of this new medicine should become available for everybody, including the poor. It couldn't just be there just for the wealthy. And as a result, they connected the church to the issues of faith and health, and it led to building hospitals all over this country whose primary purpose was to provide health care for the poor, allow the opportunity for the poor to receive the care that all this new medicine was bringing together. Now, in building these hospitals, the church owned them and the church ran them. And it worked just fine for the poor, but people of means said, hey, that's all well and good. We will make our charitable donations, but we're going to get our health care the way we always have. The doctor is going to come to my house to take care of it. So that worked just fine until in the 1930s, people actually looked at the data and came to realize that people did better in the hospital than they did having the doctor come to their house. At which point, people of means came to the church and said, we want to change the formula. We want you to keep paying for it, but we will run the hospitals for you. And the church said, fine, that works. Now that kept going until in the 1950s, the hospitals were struggling mightily financially. The hospitals now turn to the church and say, hey guys, remember, you own us and we need more money. And the church's response to that was, not on your life. So a firewall was built by the church between the hospitals and the church, so the hospitals would not be able to get at the church's money to fund them. At this point, a new profession was created, that of hospital administrator. And they were given the charge to make the hospitals work financially. They struggled in the 1950s until in 1965, they were given a gift from God,
Medicare.
the advent of Medicare and Medicaid, at which point the hospitals now start making money hand over fist. I mean, they're literally just putting money in closets. And at which point the church comes back to the hospitals and says, hey guys, remember, we own you. Only that firewall that was built by the church, went both ways. And so that was never going to happen. And the hospitals refused to let the money flow back to the church. When we get to the 1990s, churches are going, this makes no sense. And so all over the country, these church-owned hospitals were sold off to for-profit endeavors. So that happened right here in Memphis. Where? St. Joseph's, and then St. Francis Hospital is sold to what is now Tenet Hospital, a for-profit endeavor. You can only imagine what St. Francis would think about it himself. And then the money at the sale of these church-owned hospitals were put in what are known as conversion foundations. Now, the conversion foundations, originally, the money was used to do what they were intended to do, providing health care for the poor. But as the boards of the conversion foundations here in Memphis, the Assisi Foundation, I'm not picking on them because they're just like every other one, start saying, why are we only funding healthcare issues for the poor? Let's start funding, again, my friends, but the ballet or other things that are about community and not just about healthcare for the poor. And now the for-profit hospitals have to compete with the not-for-profit hospitals, and it becomes complicated. And it's all about the financial resources to do this. Until where we nationally ultimately get is that the issue of charity care comes down to where you could argue that the church-owned not-for-profit hospital do 100% more charity care than the for-profit hospitals, and you would be totally right. You could also argue, is there really that much difference between 2% and 1%? And from a church's perspective, you have to sit back and ask the question, how did we let it happen that these hospitals that were fully built for the purpose of healthcare for the poor got to where the totality of their care is 2%? How did we in the church let that happen? All right. The next question, though, is how did we get to have so many people who are uninsured? How did that come to be? So prior to World War II, 1/3 of every doctor's practice was expected to be charity care. That's how it worked. Doctors were paid with chickens, and they were happy to do that. You took care of your community. It was just part of what the nature of the profession was. And then World War II comes along, and men are overseas. Women are running the country and the business of the country. And then businesses are struggling mightily to be able to have good workers. The government imposes a wage freeze. So you cannot increase your wages in order to attract better workers. Businesses are very creative, and they start creating benefits which are not tied to wages. And along with that becomes health insurance. Blue Cross and Blue Shield are created, and then this becomes a benefit that workers really like. The war ends, you're coming back and you're trying to hire good workers and these healthcare benefits that stay in place. So now, able-bodied workers have benefits through their job. 1965 comes along. Medicare and Medicaid are created. So Medicare, I know this gets confusing between Medicare and Medicaid, but Medicare is created for the purpose of people over 65 and those with disabilities. which leaves the poor. So people think that Medicaid was created primarily for the poor. And on one level, that's true, but there's a lot of gaps in that reality. But at this point in time in 1965, with Blue Cross and Blue Shield and other health insurance from your job, Medicare, Medicaid, America came this close to having universal health care. And at this point, as a result, signs go up in doctors' offices all over the country that says payment is expected at the time of service, because it was assumed that everybody had some sort of healthcare benefits. However, very quickly, gaps emerge because Medicaid is not just about the poor. How do you get Medicaid? Anybody know? Your assumption is you're poor and you apply for it and you get it, right? No, in order to qualify for Medicaid, you must first meet what's called a categorical criteria. You must be blind, disabled, over 65, or a single mother with small children. So if you're a 50-year-old woman working, cleaning houses, or you're a guy cutting grass, you don't meet one of those categorical criteria, right? So you are never gonna qualify for Medicaid. I can take away every penny you have and you never earn another cent for the rest of your life and you won't qualify for Medicaid. So as a result, from 1965 until 1987, when church health began, 22 years, we go from having effectively universal health care to where in 1987, when I first came to Memphis and church health started, there are now 26 million uninsured Americans, almost all of them working in low-wage jobs. So the mission of church health was always to engage the church, to try to find a way for us to reclaim what the gospel has called us to do. And if you're going to use the resources of the church, you should go where the need is greatest. So that need was greatest in 1987 among the working poor, if you will. That's why church health is always focused on the working poor. It is also why we are not a federally funded anything, because the government cannot do the work of the church, and neither should we ask it to. The mission of church health is about the church. How do we reclaim what we are called to do? Now, over the last 34 years, that number, which started at 26 million, grew to 54 million, plus the immigrants. Nobody counts the immigrants. When Bernie Sanders was advocating Medicare for all, he meant Medicare for all, except for those people in our community who've been working 20 years, building our houses and doing things nobody else would do. We didn't mean that. Medicare for all didn't mean them. Nobody politically is willing to tackle that issue. But in my opinion, you would think the church would care. So the Affordable Care Act comes along, Obamacare, if you will. That has solved the problem. Yes? No. So Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, was intended to actually address this issue that we're talking about in one of two ways. The first way was the expansion of Medicaid. So all 50 states have their own Medicaid program, and yet the basic Medicaid rules are what I've already described: blind, disabled, over 65, or single mother. Now, the idea of Obamacare was that those rules could go away and my housekeeper or my gardener would now benefit from Medicaid based on their income. However, in the wisdom of the Supreme Court, they made it possible for every state to determine whether that state was going to expand Medicaid. You know, Tennessee has decided not to do that because we hate President Obama so much. Wait a minute, he is no longer the president, but we still hate him. And what we do, this is not a political statement, y'all. This is just the reality. Make sure you understand it. We now currently take $1 billion a year, really more than that, of our own tax money, your tax money, is going to provide health care for poor people in the states that have expanded Medicaid. So our tax dollars are going to provide health care for people in New York, Chicago, and LA. And they thank you for your donation. Can you tell me how in any economic world that makes sense? You know, we could have that own money to take care of our own poor people. Instead, we are giving it away to the other states. All right, so option number one is off the table. The second option was the exchange, healthcare.gov. You've heard of healthcare.gov, and the way this works is during open enrollment, not just any time, during a very small window. If you're uninsured and you qualify, you go to healthcare.gov, you put your healthcare information in, and then you will be able to purchase health insurance on the open market with a subsidy that will come from your taxes. So you will only pay a small amount of money if you qualify for health insurance through Blue Cross or other providers. Now, most of those policies have a $5,000 deductible. So you make $12 an hour. The first $5,000 of your health care to take care of your diabetes or high blood pressure is coming out of your pocket. So do you have health insurance? All right, here's the big issue. If your income is below, not above, below 138% of the poverty level, which is a moving target, changes every year, but it is roughly $12 an hour for a family of four. So of the now almost 80,000 people in Memphis who depend on church health for their health care, 80,000, 90% of them, their income is below 138% of poverty. So when they go to healthcare.gov, they put their information in. Do you know what it says to them? It says, no, it says you should apply for Medicaid in your state. Okay, I know you think I said this wrong. I've been talking too long already. You're glazed over. I can't possibly have said what I just said. But what I just told you is that the poorest people get nothing. The poorest people get nothing. The impact of the Affordable Care Act on Tennessee and our patients here in Memphis has been nothing. Jesus said the poor will always be with you. So far, he's been right. I just don't think he thought there were going to be so many poor people. So this is why church health has not gone away. It's why we're not going to go away. You know, that issue of the immigrants is still out there. Okay, so that's the situation. And so, and my question, back where I began is, so why should the church care? Is this an issue the church should care about? In light of all the terrible things that are happening in the world, you know, the church has other things to worry about, right? Except for if you read the gospel. The gospel is crystal clear. A third of the New Testament has to do with healing the sick. It calls us to provide health care for people who are poor. There is no equivocal aspect of this. If you want to follow Jesus, this is what you're expected to do. Do you really want to, at the end of time, look God in the face and have God ask you, did you think I was kidding about that part? If you are not engaged in a healing ministry in your church and actually in your own personal life, you are ignoring a third of the gospel. Here's the beauty of this, is that once you're engaged with this, it is life transforming. You know, I think this is a way out of the church's morass that we're in right now. You know, if we were to actually embrace this and take this seriously, look what could happen. You know, look, during the pandemic, the church has floundered mightily about what our role is in all of this, but has actually given us a time to sit back and rethink what church is all about. And over the next few years, we'll have even more opportunity to do this. So here at Idlewild, to ask the question, well, how do we read the gospel? I was told y'all normally pass these things out. To be honest, it's rare in a Presbyterian church to even have Bibles, but you actually have them. So I charge you to go read it. Go fact check me to see if what I'm saying is actually right. And I think you will see that it is. But it also can be so invigorating to sit back and say, okay, how are we going to take this stuff seriously? You know, what does it look like for us here in Memphis, Tennessee, you know, at this beautiful church to find a way as people are coming back to church? You know, I wrote something for the Daily Memphian just a few weeks ago saying it is time to come back to church, because dealing with the issues of Ukraine, we can't just in our own houses pray to God. We need to find a way to engage each other, but it has to go beyond just our prayers. And things like caring for the poor in our own midst when they get sick is actually something we can do. We don't have to wring our hands about this, and it will ultimately make you healthy. So I'm going to end with this. What do I mean by making you healthy? So being healthy is not about the absence of disease. The World Health Organization will agree with that. You know, who cares if you live 2 years longer, if it means 2 years longer in a nursing home? Life for life's sake can't possibly be the point. Breathing in, breathing out. None of us are signing up for that. So what we believe at Church Health is that being healthy comes down to three things. This is true for our patients, but it's also true for you. Those three things are having more joy in your life, having more love in your life, and being driven closer to God. If that's not happening, then what is the point? So I would charge you with however you are spending your life on a daily basis, examine it to see, is it bringing me more joy, more love, and driving me closer to God? If it's not, then quit doing it. If you have to quit your job, quit your job. You know, life is too short. But this is what will make you healthy. And then figure out how to do it. And then church is about how we lock arms and do this together. And what does that look like here at Idlewild? It's up to you to figure it out. But it will lead you to the most glorious experience that you can have. All right, I'm done, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So.
Scott,
Yes.
how many other cities or what other cities have a church health center type operation?
Great. So when I started in 1987, I said, if when I retire, the only time it exists is here in Memphis, then it was a bad idea. You know, what I believe is that what I just described to you works for every church, for every city. And I feel like we have the full weight of the gospel behind us. So there are actually, as it turns out this week, we are having what we call a replication seminar. There are cities, people from 5 different cities around the country. And 3 of them are actually coming from Texas, but 1 from New York, 1 from LA, and then the 3 from Texas are going to be here. There are 98 clinics around the country that are open that would tell you they're modeled after Church Health. There are dozens of other clinics that are not directly replicating us, but doing the same type of work. Because we all read the same gospel, right? Now, look, I'm not telling you this is easy. This is hard. You know, running a clinic like Church Health is not like opening a clothes closet. You know, it's difficult. It's, you know, you're dealing with people's lives. You know, if you give somebody the wrong clothes, then they look funny today. But if I give them the wrong medicine, I might kill them. So it is complicated, but it's also replicable.
And what percentage of your providers in church health are volunteers?
Great. So we have 20 providers on our staff. This is our job. We also run a family medicine residency. So everybody should care about our residency. So we do this in partnership with Baptist. It's a 3-year training program after you graduate from medical school. So there's 18 young doctors that are in our hands to turn them into good doctors. We just finished what's called the match. So just learned our 6 young doctors coming to us. For 6 jobs, if you will, this year we had 1,900 applicants. Those are all people with MD after their name. So the number one way we cut down from 1,900 to kind of get to 6, the first question is this: when you finish our program, can you see yourself practicing in Memphis? There is only one right answer. So while you should care about it, there is an overwhelming chance that we are training a young doctor who will ultimately take care of somebody in your family, your children, your grandchildren. And so you should be paying attention to what we're doing for that reason. Now, we then have 1,000 doctors who volunteer with us. That's not a made up number. So how the volunteer doctors work is, I'm a dumb family practitioner. If I need the cardiologist, the orthopedist, they are willing to see patients mostly for us in their own office. And then the doctor will donate his or her time. And then the hospitals will not generate a bill as long as the physician's volunteering their time. Some of those doctors are super specialists, and I only need them once a year. But when you need them, you need them. And so we're able to cut away all the issue of how it's going to get paid for in that way. And then lastly, something I never anticipated is what I call my retired doctor phenomenon. So we now run 62 subspecialty clinics with retired doctors. These are doctors who 5 years ago, you would say that's the best doctor in Memphis. They now retired. They're almost all men. They go play golf for 6 months and their wife calls me and says, can't you do something? So we have built them a bit of a playground. And then they come and see patients for us. If that patient needs surgery, they go to their old clinic. It's just a wonderful thing to watch.
That's great.
Does Church Health offer any kind of insurance through Church Health?
Okay, yes. So this gets complicated here, but so bear me out. So we have something called the Memphis Plan. So the Memphis Plan costs $50 a month. So if you have a housekeeper and she's uninsured, $50 a month, the employer, meaning you, has to pay at least $10 a month. Now you could split it 50-50, you could pay the whole 50, but you have to pay the at least 10, and then you're going to send the money to us. Now, your housekeeper is now going to be assigned to a volunteer doctor who will be her doctor, could end up being the same doctor you go to. If she needs a bypass operation, it will cost $5 and that's it. No deductible, no copayment. That's better insurance than anybody in this room has. And yet it's all driven by volunteers. So if you have a housekeeper or somebody cutting your grass and they're uninsured, you need to put them on the Memphis Plan. It is a way that you can take seriously what I was just telling about. A way you could be involved in health ministry is getting that person who is helping you have health insurance to the Memphis Plan. Why would you not do it? It's only going to cost you $10 a month and then a little of your time to explain it to her so that she doesn't think it's a scam.
And for the self-employed,
Same thing. So here's how the Memphis Plan worked. In 1989, I had a partner who had something that I actually hate, which is called a husband, who took her to Virginia. So all of a sudden, I'm having to see 60 patients a day, which you just can't do that. So in the shower one day, I had this vision of going to Memphis Medical Society, getting them to get their primary care doctors to volunteer to see patients in their own office. Doctors who are subspecialists would volunteer, everything I just described to you, which is the Memphis Plan. So we're now ready to roll this out. And I get a call from the Department of Insurance in Nashville. So they had heard about it. It was a really good idea. There was only one problem. It was illegal. It sounded like health insurance. We didn't meet the rules to be an insurance company. So if something is illegal and yet you think it's a good idea, there's only one rational thing to do, which is
change the law.
Change the law. So with the help of the Tennessee Medical Association and Blue Cross, we ultimately end up passing what's called the Memphis Plan Act of 1991. So what I just described to you in the state of Tennessee is not health insurance. That's all it says. But it meant that we were no longer subject to being regulated by the Department of Insurance. So anyway, that's how it all came about, and I forgot what your question was.
I can go to the website, but my question was about the self-employed.
Oh, sorry. So, yeah, so one of the caveats of the law is that the person can't make more than 200% of the poverty. So that is the issue. So we will vet them to make sure that their income is below 200% of the poverty level. Yeah. Yes, that's the issue with the self-employed. Yeah.
Really interesting.
Y'all, so I hope you understand, everything I've been talking about is about the church. This is not what we generally talk about in church. But every last thing I've been saying, I believe, is church. This is what church in today's world needs to look like. Yes, we need to come together corporately in order to worship together. No question about that. But you can't just leave it at that. This is how we grow the church. This is how the church grew in the first few centuries, right? This is how we can ultimately grow the church today. Because at the end of the day, what we are talking about is evangelism. This is how you help people figure out that the church matters to them. It's not about believing a set of issues that we may or may not all agree on. But what we can agree on is that God expects us to care for this body, expects us to care for the poor, and expects us to do it together in a way that is under what we believe is God's kingdom. All right, thanks, God, for having me. Take care.